Hello everybody, this is a very quick presentation that will help finish off your Introduction to Youth Culture booklet. Now, obviously we've already looked at youth cultures and you have presented on a wide number of these to the class. You will have filled out page 4 in your booklet, whereby we looked from the 1950s and the Teddy Boys and the Mods and the Rockers all the way to kind of 90s ravers and maybe even chavs if somebody did it in your particular group in the noughties. So we've looked at these wide number of different subcultures, all potentially neo-tribes, remember, if you are or were part of the ravers group, because they were slightly different. And we are going to finish that booklet now, starting with page number 6. Now I'm sure some of the classes are already a little bit further ahead, so they may very well have done page number 6, 7 and 8, but this will round up and finish off that booklet for you. So we looked at all of these subcultures, but what we find is that they don't tend to be subcultures in the UK, particularly before World War II, which is why we need to look briefly and investigate the social conditions which enable these youth cultures to kind of exist and form. So, in your booklet, you'll see that you've got a circle where you can draw a visual representation for this reason, and then you've got the rectangle where you can simply write it out. We're going to look from Marwick's research, which takes place after World War II, and Marwick developed some reasons why, some social reasons, some economic reasons why we see kind of the formation of youth subcultures beginning after that point. So, first one is disposable income and economic growth. We start to see the economy return, we start to have more freedom for people to work and women to work, and we start to see wages kind of going up, and more wages, more disposable income, more money for people to go and buy things. And I think maybe the Teddy Boys, everybody had a Teddy Boys group presentation. We'll see that kind of first real consumer subculture where they were targeted with the suits, with the shoes, you know, they were the kind of young market who were getting plugged for these particular clothing. Delayed adulthood. You guys are in a position where perhaps you could say you've had the longest adulthood of any generation ever, but we started to see people in the 50s starting to get more access to education and starting to stay in school for longer, thus, you know, spreading out their period of childhood, so that they didn't have to go into the workplace straight away. They had the freedom to be educated. Obviously, there was more leisure and sports and things and facilities for people to do. Quite simply, that made a difference. As I talked about the Teddy Boys here, the fact that there was more income made teenagers the focus in the media. They were the main consumers of fashion, of music, and you can see that most notably in the Teddy Boys. And of course, this one, multiculturalism. You will have seen and heard from the Rastas and how that religion, but also subculture, was influenced by the racism that was felt upon their arrival of British shores from boats like the Windrush. And of course, that's going to have an impact on the Rastas forming. It was a second generation of those Rastas who kind of, or second generation of those migrants who came on to really embody kind of like the Rasta spirit. But also groups like the skinheads. We saw the very unpleasant and racist skinheads. We talked about those. They wouldn't be existing if there wasn't multiculturalism, the same as the Rastas. So the impact of multiculturalism has a big impact when it comes to resisting racism or being racist in itself, and obviously will have shaped the society and kind of affect our hybrid cultures that we see every day now. So these are the conditions which enable our youth cultures to form. Hopefully you'll have written each one down in its individual box. Before we look at the differences, which will be on page 7, between the mainstream and youth culture. Now, as you'll see here, and hopefully this is fairly, you know, self-explanatory when you're filling out this table. You know, everybody is in the mainstream culture. It is the one for everybody, but for our youth, they're specific age people, and it's going to be young people who are in those groups. Everybody's part of the mainstream, but for youth it's completely exclusive. You've got to adhere to the norms and values of that particular group to belong, and some of the norms and values will be specific forms of dress only appropriate for that particular group and that particular age of people. We tend to see that these youth cultures are kind of fighting back, rebellious almost resistant to the mainstream culture. The punks will have told you about that. The skinheads will have told you about that to some degree. Even Rasta, you know, in its rebellious and kind of resistant form against the mainstream, against capitalism, is commonly an idea that runs through it that they're quite anti. This is the thing though, you go for the Teds and the Mods and Rockers, you go on to then the hippies, and punk, and skins, and ravers, and what do you notice? Well, it's about 10 years, and then that's it, they die out. So they're short-lived, they change frequently. We'll be talking about why that happens. And remember, in theory, we'll look at a couple of examples where this isn't the case, but in theory, your membership of a youth culture or a youth subculture is temporary. It is a short-lived thing. You don't do it all the way through your life. People who were punks back in the 70s and the 80s would probably not be considering themselves punks now. And they certainly won't be adhering to those norms and values quite as rigidly as they would have before. So please make sure you've got the table filled out comparing the characteristics of the mainstream to the youth culture. Often you will find that they are kind of polar opposites of one another. Now, what we've got to look at on page number 8 in your booklet, the one which looks like this, is the reasons why people join youth subcultures. And you will see there are 5 reasons that we've got down on here. To take on an identity, you're labelled as a rite of passage, to rebel against capitalism, to consume the latest fashion trends, and as a solution to problems like racism or sexism. Now, we have previously discussed and introduced you to 5 social theories: functionalism, Marxism, interactionism, feminism, and postmodernism. What I would like you to do to see if you can link these 5 theories to these 5 different explanations. So maybe just pause it now in your booklet on page 8, see if you can make a judgment as to, well, I know that one will be Marxist, I know that one must be feminist. See what you end up left with and see if you can guess what each of these theories will say. Just pause the video and give yourself a whirl of completing that task. Right, hopefully you've had a good shot at doing it, and we can go through the 5 theories and link them up to 5 different explanations. When we start with functionalism, this is a rite of passage. Now, when we say a rite of passage, we often mean a transition from one thing to another, a movement, if you will, to bridge the gap between child and adult. That would be a functionalist explanation. Why? Because it gives youth culture a reason, a purpose, a function. So we can link that straight in to functionalism because it's a positive thing. It allows you to go from one thing to another. Rites of passage are very useful, therefore it's obviously got to be a functionalist perspective. When we look at a Marxist perspective on the board, I'm hoping we all pick that one as resistance and rebellion against capitalism. We know that our Marxists will be negative towards the economic system of capitalism, and therefore youth cultures that will form to fight this will be a very Marxist idea. Our feminists will be obviously as a solution to problems such as racism or sexism, the fact that they might think that we live in a patriarchal society, which means male dominated, and then the youth subcultures may form to resist against that idea. We move on to postmodernists, which would be to consume the latest fashion trends. Remember, when you are thinking about postmodernism, it's all about individualism, all about you and your choices. You can pick and choose what you believe in, pick and choose your style, your friendships. You can switch from day to day into a different style just because it suits the way that you're feeling at that moment, which of course will bring us to the final one, which is interactionism, which is taken on an identity. You are labelled. We've talked enough now about Howard Becker, an interactionist thinker, and his idea of labelling theory, that hopefully as soon as you see the idea of somebody getting labelled, you know it'll be from an interactionist perspective. So, Marxists, young people rebelling against the economic system which marginalises them. Postmodernists, spending your money on music and fashion, it's all consumer-led. You are a consumer, you're an individual, buy, pick and choose whatever it is you want to believe, or however it is you want to look. Problems such as sexism, perhaps we are oppressed, maybe live in a patriarchal society that might cause us to, need to form a subculture. Make sure that you've got very quick, outlines of these underneath each of your reasons. Taken on identity, we're labelled, which is obviously talking about giving out labels, back to Howard Becker, and as a rite of passage, a useful purpose to bridge the gap as you transition from child to adult. Youth is in the middle, and it's very, very useful. We are going to look now at 4 writers who should be able to fit in on page number 9 of your handout. And I think this is where most people have not got up to. So some of the other groups, all groups will not have looked at these. So what I would like you to do is try and see if you can summarise these points for each of these writers that we're going to be looking at. Now, we're going to start in the next few weeks having quite a few key writers and key theorists whose ideas and concepts we're going to have to explain and be able to evaluate in order to answer the questions in the exam. The first one that we're going to look at is this idea that youth cultures form as a resistance to capitalism, exaggerating our working class values, and we can look at the work of Hall and Jefferson, showed that the Teddy Boys was an expression of contempt for the middle class, maybe you could even say the bourgeois values of society. Which perspective would that belong to? Marxism. Okay, so on page number 9, can you summarise that, please? And try and remember Stuart Hall, Hall and Jefferson, and their ideas about the Teddy Boys, because these will come up when we study Marxism. B. Bennett and Hetherington would say that youth is a social construct, so you can pick and choose everything essentially. About your friendship groups, your social groups, your class, your age, your gender, your ethnicity are all irrelevant, okay? It does not matter what class you're in anymore. You can be wearing the exact same clothes as somebody next to you who might be a middle class son of 2 doctors, while you're a working class lad. You could look exactly the same, you could talk the same, nobody would know the difference. And this is what Bennett and Hetherington's idea is, that everything is a social construct, and youth is obviously a social construct as well that you can pick and choose. Well, which theory is that going to belong to? On page number 9, it's obviously going to be postmodernism, because they're going to say everything's a social construct. It's all about you picking and choosing as an individual. Important to note here, class, ethnicity, gender, irrelevant. Well, they were only irrelevant in one subculture, and I'll use the term loosely, that we looked at last week, and that was the ravers. And if you remember, we didn't say it was a subculture, we called it a neo-triad. And the reason for that is because, it didn't matter what background you were from when you went to a rave. You could have been any gender, you could have been any class, any ethnicity, it didn't matter. So that will be your postmodern section. Can you please write down a summary of that using Bennett and Hetherington, because we're going to try and revise these writers next time we are in class. Obviously, Howard Becker comes up next, which means on page number 9 we're talking about interactionists, and this idea that being labelled as an outsider in society will mean that you are more likely to kind of join a subculture and embed yourself in a deviant subculture, especially if the media, the police, the general public are there to give you the label of deviant or, any kind of negative connotations, really. So that is your summary for Howard Becker. You should be very familiar with him so far for interactionism. Can you make sure that's down on page number 9? And finally, your last one. Now, this fella you will have come across before. This is Talcott Parsons. Parsons would say youth culture is a rite of passage, which is a time where we see kind of like a movement from one thing to another. So here we see childhood to adulthood being the key idea that he considers, and this will be able to bridge the gap. So it kind of makes it a smoother transition from, you don't just go from child to adult, you have youth in the middle, which is this kind of drawn out period which helps you move from one thing to the other. Can you summarise that on page 9? And that will mean that your introduction to youth culture booklet is now complete, and you can move on and we can start the youth as a social construct lesson, which is based from this handout that you should all have. When we come back, which will be the week after, we will start looking at the functionist perspective, but we'll make sure we check that we know, right, well, what will our social theories say about youth culture? What is the reason that they will form? So we'll do a quick bit of revision of that as well, but try and ensure that your booklets are filled in and everything's looking splendid. Okay, thanks.